The water hit Rosa Mae Thompson like a slap across 73 years of dignity. Cold, shocking, deliberate. It soaked through her Sunday dress. The one she'd pressed that morning for church. The one her late husband had always said made her look like an angel. Now it clung to her frail shoulders as she stood on her own front porch, trembling not from the autumn chill, but from the pure malice in Officer Derek Walsh's pale blue eyes. "Next time you'll think twice before disturbing the peace with your gospel music," Walsh sneered, setting the empty pitcher down on her porch railing with deliberate force. The sound echoed through Maple Street like a gunshot, drawing curious faces to windows up and down the block. "Some of us work night shifts and need our sleep." Rosa Mae's lips parted, but no words came. In all her years living in this modest Cleveland neighborhood, through decades of raising 3 children as a single mother after her husband's death in Vietnam, through every struggle and small victory, no one had ever treated her with such calculated cruelty. Her hands shook as she tried to wring water from her dress, the fabric heavy and cold against her skin. I was just singing hymns while I tended my garden," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's Sunday morning. I didn't mean to—" "You didn't mean to what disturbed decent people trying to sleep." Walsh stepped closer, his 6-foot frame towering over her diminutive figure. His uniform, pristine and pressed, seemed to amplify his authority as much as her wet dress diminished hers. "Lady, I don't care if it's Sunday, Monday, or Christmas. When I tell you to keep it down, you keep it down. Are we clear?" The morning sun cast long shadows across the porch, but Rosa Mae felt like she was standing in complete darkness. She nodded slowly, her silver hair dripping, her brown eyes downcast. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of her neighbor Mrs. Patterson's screen door closing, the subtle retreat of another witness who wouldn't dare speak up. What Rosa Mae didn't see was 17-year-old Marcus Chen crouched behind the hedge that separated his family's property from hers. His phone held steady despite his shaking hands. He'd been walking their dog when he heard the commotion, drawn by the harsh voice and cruel laughter. Now, peering through the branches, he watched in horror as Officer Walsh humiliated a woman who'd always been kind to him, who'd given him homemade cookies when his parents worked late, who'd never been anything but a gentle presence in their neighborhood. Marcus's thumb hovered over the record button. He knew he should do something, say something, but his 17-year-old voice felt small against the weight of that uniform, that badge, that gun holstered so casually at Walsh's hip. Instead, he pressed record and held his breath, documenting every cruel second. "Good," Walsh said, apparently satisfied by Rosa Mae's silence. "And if I have to come back here again, it won't be just water next time. Understood?" Rosa Mae nodded again, tears mixing with the water on her cheeks. Walsh turned and walked back to his patrol car with the swagger of someone who'd never faced consequences for his actions, who'd grown comfortable in the certainty that his word would always carry more weight than hers. The car door slammed shut, like a period at the end of a sentence, final and definitive. As the patrol car pulled away, Rosa Mae stood alone on her porch, dripping and shivering. She could feel eyes watching from behind curtains, could sense the discomfort of neighbors who'd witnessed her humiliation, but felt powerless to intervene. The Sunday morning that had begun with such peace and joy now felt ruined, tainted by the casual cruelty of someone who was supposed to protect and serve. Marcus waited until the police car disappeared around the corner before emerging from his hiding spot. His hands were still shaking as he ended the recording. 3 minutes and 47 seconds of clear, undeniable evidence. He looked at Rosa Mae, still standing on her porch, and felt a surge of anger so pure it surprised him. "Mrs. Thompson," he called softly, approaching her fence. "Are you okay?" She looked up, startled, then offered him a weak smile that broke his heart. "Oh, Marcus. Honey, I'm fine. Just a little wet. That's all." But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. The water would dry, but the humiliation, the violation of her dignity in her own home, would linger long after her dress was clean and pressed again. "Mrs. Thompson, I recorded what just happened," Marcus said, his voice gaining strength. "What that officer did to you, it wasn't right. It wasn't legal." Rosa May's eyes widened. "Oh, Marcus, you don't want to get involved in this. That man has a badge. People like us, we just have to—" "No," Marcus interrupted, surprising himself with his vehemence. "We don't have to accept this. Not anymore." That afternoon, while Rosa May changed into dry clothes and tried to forget the morning's humiliation, Marcus sat in his bedroom, staring at his phone. The video was clear, the audio perfect. Walsh's voice, cruel and contemptuous. Rosa May's quiet dignity, even in the face of such treatment. The deliberate nature of the act. The way Walsh had savored her helplessness. Marcus had grown up in the social media age. He understood the power of viral content, the way a single video could change everything. But he also understood the potential consequences. Police officers had been known to retaliate against those who exposed their misconduct. His parents, immigrants who'd worked tirelessly to build their life in America, might face backlash. But as he watched the video again, seeing Rosa May's face crumple with each drop of water, his decision crystallized. Some things were more important than safety. Some injustices demanded to be exposed, regardless of the personal cost. He posted the video to TikTok first, then Twitter and Instagram, with a simple caption: "Cleveland police officer humiliates elderly woman for singing hymns in her own garden. This is not okay. This is not justice." Justice for Rosa May. For the first few hours, the video gained modest traction. A few dozen likes, some supportive comments, a handful of shares. Marcus checked obsessively, refreshing the page every few minutes, willing the world to care about what had happened to Mrs. Thompson. Then, around dinner time, something shifted. The shares multiplied exponentially. Comments poured in from across the country, then around the world. People expressing outrage, sharing their own stories of police misconduct, demanding justice. By midnight, the video had been viewed over 50,000 times. By morning, it had reached 1 million. The transformation was rapid and overwhelming. News outlets picked up the story. Reporters camped outside Rosa May's modest house, seeking interviews she was too frightened to give. Her phone rang constantly until she finally unplugged it. The woman who'd spent her entire life trying to remain invisible suddenly found herself at the center of a national conversation about police brutality and systemic racism. "I just want this to go away," she told Marcus when he visited that Tuesday evening, finding her peeking through drawn curtains at the gathering crowd of media and protesters outside. "I never asked for any of this attention. I know, Mrs. Thompson, and I'm sorry. But maybe this is bigger than what we want. Maybe this is what needs to happen." Meanwhile, Officer Derek Walsh was discovering that his casual cruelty had consequences he'd never anticipated. Internal Affairs had launched an investigation. The mayor's office was fielding calls from angry constituents. His wife was getting strange looks at the grocery store. His children were asking why their classmates were saying Daddy was a bad man. But Walsh wasn't one to go down quietly. When reporters cornered him outside the precinct, he doubled down on his actions. I responded to a legitimate noise complaint, he stated, his jaw set in stubborn defiance. The suspect was non-compliant and disrespectful. I used appropriate de-escalation techniques. The phrase appropriate de-escalation techniques became a bitter joke on social media, spawning memes and hashtags that only fueled the growing outrage. Videos surfaced of Walsh's previous encounters with citizens, a pattern of aggression and intimidation that painted a clear picture of an officer drunk on power. As the story gained national traction, lawyers began reaching out to Rosa May, offering to represent her pro bono. Most she politely declined, overwhelmed by the attention and uncertain whether she wanted to pursue legal action. She was, after all, a woman who'd spent 7 decades avoiding confrontation, who'd been raised to believe that making waves only led to drowning. But then came the phone call that changed everything. It was Thursday evening, nearly a week after the incident, when Rosa May's landline rang. She'd reconnected it that morning, hoping the media frenzy was finally dying down. The voice on the other end was familiar, yet strange, deeper and more polished than she remembered. "Mama!" Rosa May nearly dropped the receiver. She hadn't heard from her youngest son in over 3 years, not since their last bitter argument about his career, his priorities, his abandonment of the faith and family values she'd tried to instill. David, is that really you?" "Yes, Mama. I saw the video. I saw what that bastard did to you." His voice was tight with controlled fury. "I'm flying home tonight." David Thompson had left Cleveland 20 years ago with a full scholarship to Harvard Law School and had never really come back. He'd built a brilliant career as a civil rights attorney in Washington, D.C., taking on cases that made national headlines, representing victims of police brutality and systemic injustice. He'd won settlements in the millions, had argued cases before the Supreme Court, had been profiled in Time magazine as one of America's most influential legal minds. But he'd also become someone his mother barely recognized. Success had changed him, hardened him. He drove expensive cars, lived in a penthouse apartment, dated women who seemed more interested in his celebrity than his character. When Rosa May had asked him to come home for Christmas 3 years ago, he'd sent money instead. When she'd called to tell him about her diabetes diagnosis, he'd had his assistant send flowers. The distance between them had grown so vast that Rosa May hadn't even thought to mention his name to the reporters or lawyers who'd contacted her. In her mind, David belonged to a different world now, one where powerful people fought powerful battles. She was just an old woman who sang hymns in her garden. She had no idea that her son had built his entire career on cases exactly like hers. David arrived at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport at 11:47 p.m., his Armani suit wrinkled from the red-eye flight, his usually perfect hair disheveled. He hadn't been back to his childhood neighborhood in over 5 years, and, as his rental car navigated the familiar streets, he was struck by how small everything seemed, how different from the power corridors of Washington where he spent his days. But when he pulled up to his mother's house and saw her peering through the curtains, her face lit with tentative hope, something cracked open in his chest. The years of distance, of professional success built on emotional detachment, suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. "Oh, my boy," Rosa May whispered as she opened the door, her arms wrapping around him with the fierce love that had never diminished despite their estrangement. "My baby boy." David held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and vanilla that had defined home for the first 18 years of his life. For a moment, he wasn't David Thompson, Esquire, terror of courthouse opposing counsels. He was just Davy, Rosa May's youngest, the one who used to sit in her lap while she sang spirituals and told stories about his father. I'm sorry, Mama, he said, his voice breaking. I'm sorry I wasn't here. I'm sorry you had to go through this alone. You're here now, she said simply, stepping back to study his face. That's what matters. They sat in her small living room, the same one where he'd done homework at the coffee table while she cooked dinner, where she'd bandaged his scraped knees and listened to his teenage heartbreaks. The furniture was older, more worn, but everything else was exactly as he remembered. Tell me what happened, he said, his legal mind already working, cataloging potential charges and civil rights violations. Everything, from the beginning. Rosa May recounted the morning, her voice growing smaller as she described the water, the humiliation, the casual cruelty. David listened without interruption, his hands clenched in his lap, his jaw tight with controlled rage. Mama, do you understand what this is? What he did to you? David's voice was gentle but firm. This isn't just about a noise complaint. This is assault. This is a violation of your civil rights. This is the kind of case that changes things. I don't want to change things, Rosa May said quietly. I just want it to go away. I want to go back to my garden and my hymns and my quiet life. But it won't go away. Not anymore. The whole world is watching now. David leaned forward, taking her weathered hands in his manicured ones. Mama, I've spent my entire career fighting cases like this. I've represented families destroyed by police violence, communities terrorized by officers who think their badge makes them untouchable. But I've never had a case this clear-cut, this undeniable. He paused, looking around the room that held so many memories. And I've never had a case where the victim was my own mother. The next morning, the news broke. Local reporters had been digging into Rosa May's background, trying to understand why her story had resonated so powerfully. When they discovered that the humble, dignified woman who'd been humiliated on her own porch was the mother of David Thompson, one of the nation's most prominent civil rights attorneys, the story exploded into national headlines. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News. Every major outlet picked up the angle. The quiet elderly woman wasn't just a victim of police brutality. She was the mother of the lawyer who'd successfully sued police departments from Los Angeles to New York, who'd secured record-breaking settlements for victims of racial profiling and excessive force. Officer Derek Walsh, already under investigation and facing mounting public pressure, suddenly found himself in an entirely different league of trouble. This wasn't just about local politics and media attention anymore. This was about facing one of the most skilled and relentless civil rights attorneys in the country in court. You didn't think to mention that your son is David Thompson, Marcus asked Rosa May when he visited that afternoon, grinning despite the chaos outside her house. It never occurred to me that it mattered, she admitted. David and we've been distant for so long. I didn't think he'd care about an old woman's troubles. Mrs. Thompson, your son has dedicated his entire career to caring about exactly these kinds of troubles. David held his first press conference that afternoon on the steps of the Cleveland courthouse, an imposing figure in his perfectly tailored suit. Every inch the powerful attorney who'd struck fear into corporate boardrooms and police departments across the country. But when he spoke about his mother, his voice carried a personal pain that humanized his professional fury. Rosa May Thompson is my mother, he began, his voice carrying across the crowd of reporters and supporters who'd gathered. She's also a woman who spent her entire life serving others. She raised 3 children alone after my father died in Vietnam. She worked double shifts as a nurse's aide to put us through school. She's never asked for anything from anyone, never demanded attention or recognition. He paused, looking directly into the cameras, What Officer Derek Walsh did to her was not just a violation of her civil rights. It was an assault on everything decent and honorable about community, about respect for our elders, about the basic human dignity that every person deserves regardless of their race, their age, or their station in life. The crowd behind him erupted in applause. But David wasn't finished. His voice grew harder, more focused. I've spent 20 years fighting cases like this, representing victims of police misconduct across this country. But I've never taken a case as personal as this one. Officer Walsh humiliated my mother. He violated her dignity. He abused his power in the most cowardly way possible. He leaned into the microphone, his eyes blazing with righteous anger. And now, he's going to face the consequences of that choice in every available legal forum. We will pursue criminal charges. We will file a federal civil rights lawsuit. We will seek damages not just for the assault, but for the intentional infliction of emotional distress, for the violation of her constitutional rights, and for the pattern of misconduct that this incident represents. The legal machinery that David set in motion moved with the precision and force of his reputation. Within days, he'd assembled a team of the country's top civil rights attorneys, investigators who began documenting Walsh's history of misconduct, and expert witnesses who could speak to the psychological and societal impact of his actions. Meanwhile, the video continued to spread, shared and reshared millions of times across every social media platform. Rosa May's story became a rallying cry for communities that had suffered similar indignities, for families who'd lost loved ones to police violence, for anyone who'd ever felt powerless in the face of institutional authority. Protests organized in Cleveland and dozens of other cities. Peaceful gatherings where people held signs reading, "Justice for Rosa May," and "Dignity for All." The movement that grew around her story was different from others. Though, there was something about the image of this elderly woman, soaked and shivering on her own porch, that transcended political divisions and spoke to a basic sense of human decency. Officer Walsh, meanwhile, was discovering that his casual cruelty had consequences that extended far beyond his job. Death threats arrived at his home. His children faced harassment at school. His wife's business lost clients. The Cleveland Police Union, initially supportive, began distancing themselves as more videos of his misconduct surfaced. The investigation revealed a pattern that shocked even veteran internal affairs investigators. Walsh had accumulated dozens of complaints over his 15-year career. Allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and verbal abuse that had been repeatedly dismissed or resulted in minimal punishment. The city had paid out over $300,000 in settlements related to his conduct, costs that had been quietly absorbed without addressing the underlying problem. How did this man keep his badge? David demanded during a heated city council meeting 2 weeks after the incident. How many Rosa May Thompsons have to be humiliated? How many citizens have to be terrorized? Before this city takes responsibility for the officers it puts on our streets. The mayor, a thin man who'd built his career on avoiding controversy, squirmed under David's withering cross-examination. "Mr. Thompson, we're conducting a thorough investigation." "You've been conducting investigations for 15 years, while this officer terrorized my mother's neighborhood." David shot back. "The time for investigations is over. The time for accountability is now." The civil case moved forward with unprecedented speed. David's team uncovered documentation that painted a damning picture not just of Walsh's misconduct, but of a department culture that enabled and protected officers like him. Email chains revealed supervisors joking about complaints against Walsh. Performance reviews glossed over serious allegations. The pattern was clear and undeniable. But the real turning point came during Walsh's deposition, conducted in a sterile conference room downtown. David faced his mother's tormentor across a polished table. Every question calculated to expose the mindset that had led to that Sunday morning's cruelty. Officer Walsh, you testified that you received a noise complaint about Mrs. Thompson singing. Who made that complaint? Walsh shifted uncomfortably. It was called in anonymously. Anonymously, so you have no record of who complained. That's not unusual. People don't always want to leave their names. David consulted his notes, his expression neutral. Officer Walsh, I've reviewed the dispatch logs for that morning. There's no record of any noise complaint called in about Maple Street. Would you like to explain that discrepancy? The silence stretched for long seconds. Walsh's attorney whispered urgently in his ear. But the damage was done. David had just established that there had been no complaint, that Walsh's entire justification for the encounter was fabricated. So you lied about the noise complaint, David continued, his voice perfectly calm. You invented a justification for confronting an elderly woman who was singing hymns in her own garden. There must be some mistake in the records. The only mistake, Officer Walsh, was your decision to abuse your power to humiliate my mother? David leaned back in his chair, his voice growing colder. Tell me, when you poured that water on her, when you watched her stand there soaked and shaking, what were you thinking? Walsh's facade finally cracked. His face flushed red. And for a moment, the mask of professionalism slipped away. Look, maybe I went a little overboard, but she needed to learn some respect. These people think they can do whatever they want. These people? David's voice was deadly quiet. What do you mean by these people? Officer Walsh. The question hung in the air like a sword. Walsh's attorney was frantically signaling him to stop talking. But the damage was already done. In that moment of unguarded anger, Walsh had revealed the racial animus that had motivated his actions. The deposition transcript, when released to the media, became the final nail in Walsh's coffin. The phrase "these people" became a hashtag, a symbol of the casual racism that too often hid behind badges and uniforms. Community leaders who had initially remained neutral now called for his immediate termination and prosecution. The Cleveland Police Department, facing mounting pressure and the prospect of a massive federal lawsuit, finally acted. Walsh was terminated, his pension revoked, his law enforcement certification permanently suspended. The announcement came during a press conference where the police chief, flanked by city officials, offered a formal apology to Rosa May and promised comprehensive reforms. But David wasn't satisfied with administrative punishment. The criminal case proceeded in parallel, with prosecutors charging Walsh with assault, violation of civil rights under color of law, and filing false police reports. The trial, held in the same courthouse where David had held his first press conference, became a symbol of accountability in action. Rosa May, initially reluctant to testify, found her voice on the witness stand. As she recounted that Sunday morning, her quiet dignity was more powerful than any fiery speech. The jury, a diverse group of Cleveland residents, listened in rapt attention as she described not just the physical discomfort of being soaked with water, but the deeper wounds to her spirit and sense of safety in her own community. He made me feel small, she said simply, her hands folded in her lap. Like I didn't matter. Like my home wasn't really my home. The video, played for the jury on a large screen, was devastating in its clarity. Walsh's cruelty was undeniable, his pleasure in Rosa May's humiliation obvious to anyone watching. When the prosecution rested its case, even Walsh's defense attorney seemed deflated, his closing argument perfunctory and half-hearted. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Judge Patricia Williams, the first black woman to serve on the Cleveland County bench, sentenced Walsh to 18 months in prison, the maximum allowable under the sentencing guidelines. But her words during sentencing carried more weight than the prison term itself. "Officer Walsh, you took an oath to protect and serve," she said, her voice resonating through the packed courtroom. "Instead, you used your position of authority to humiliate and degrade a vulnerable member of our community. Your actions weren't just criminal. They were a betrayal of everything law enforcement should represent." She looked directly at him, her gaze unflinching. "You have brought shame not just on yourself, but on every honest police officer who risks their life to keep our communities safe. The sentence of this court reflects not just your crimes, but the critical importance of holding those who wear the badge to the highest standards of conduct." The civil case concluded 6 months later with a settlement that shocked legal observers. The city agreed to pay Rosa May $2.8 million, one of the largest settlements ever awarded in a case involving police misconduct against an elderly victim. But more importantly, the settlement included comprehensive reforms to police training, accountability measures, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board with real power to investigate misconduct complaints. David donated his entire legal fee to a foundation dedicated to supporting elderly victims of crime, a gesture that surprised no one who knew him, but meant everything to his mother. The distance that had grown between them over the years had been bridged by crisis, and both discovered that the love between mother and son was stronger than pride, success, or the accumulation of old hurts. Rosa May used a portion of her settlement to establish a community garden in the vacant lot next to her house, a place where neighbors could gather to grow vegetables and flowers together. She called it the Dignity Garden, and, on sunny mornings, she could be found there tending tomato plants and singing the same hymns that had started everything. But the impact of her story extended far beyond Cleveland. The video had sparked a national conversation about police accountability, the treatment of elderly citizens, and the power of community solidarity in the face of injustice. Police departments across the country implemented new training programs on de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. The Rosa May Standard became shorthand for the kind of respectful, dignified treatment that every citizen deserved from law enforcement. Marcus Chen, the teenager whose decision to record the incident had set everything in motion, received a full scholarship to study journalism at Northwestern University. In his application essay, he wrote about the power of bearing witness, about the responsibility that comes with the ability to document injustice. "I learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is point a camera and press record," he wrote. Mrs. Thompson's dignity in the face of cruelty taught me that justice isn't just about laws and courts. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person, especially those who society tends to overlook. A year after the incident, Rosa May and David stood together in the Dignity Garden, watching as neighborhood children played among the sunflowers while their parents tended neat rows of vegetables. The community that had once watched silently from behind curtains had found its voice, had learned that speaking up for each other made them all stronger. "You know what I learned through all this," Rosa May said, her hands dirty from replanting marigolds, her face peaceful in the afternoon sun. "What's that, Mama?" "That sometimes God lets terrible things happen so that better things can grow from them." She gestured toward the garden, toward the children laughing and playing, toward the neighbors who now stopped to chat instead of hurrying past with downcast eyes. "That man thought he could make me small. Instead, he helped me grow bigger than I ever imagined I could be." David smiled, thinking about how his mother's quiet strength had accomplished more than all his courtroom victories combined. She had reminded an entire nation that dignity wasn't something that could be taken away by cruel people with badges and guns. It was something that came from within, that grew stronger when it was challenged, that multiplied when it was shared. As the sun set over Cleveland, Rosa Mae Thompson began to hum a hymn, the same one she'd been singing that Sunday morning when Officer Walsh had tried to silence her. But now, her voice was joined by others' children playing in the garden, neighbors working in their plots, strangers who had become friends through shared outrage and collective action. The song rose into the evening air, no longer a solitary act of faith, but a chorus of community, a declaration that some things' dignity, justice, the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary change could never be silenced, no matter how hard anyone tried. And in that moment, listening to the voices blend together in perfect harmony, Rosa Mae knew that every drop of water, every moment of humiliation, every tear shed in anger and frustration had been worth it. Because sometimes, when power meets justice, justice sings louder than anything that tries to drown it out.